Every wrestler loves to get a big push, as it means their stock rises and opportunities increase. Conversely though, what a wrestler most certainly doesn't want is for that to turn into the dreaded stop-start push, as this can do more to harm someone's overall momentum in the long run. But just what are the most notable examples of stop-start pushes in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Sheamus. Now, it might seem strange at first glance to think of Sheamus, a multiple-time former world champion, as being someone who is the victim of a stop-start push, but he really has been at times. And part of the reason for that is because he's just been with WWE so long now. Seriously, given he debuted on the main roster in 2009, we are now approaching 2 decades of the Irishman on either Raw or SmackDown. Needless to say then, there have been times during this period where he's been a highly focused upon act, such as during his rookie year when he was able to beat John Cena for the WWE title, or during his WrestleMania program with his gym buddy Triple H. But then there are also times when he's very much been put on the back burner. Yes, for parts of his WWE run, it's felt like Sheamus has been doing little of importance at all, and this has always stopped him from feeling like a tippy-top guy. Why did the Dublin native never ascend to the level of permanent main eventer status like some others around him did? It's hard to say. It's not like he didn't have everything that Vince McMahon was looking for in a superstar, and it's not as if he couldn't get fans behind him whenever he needed to. Maybe it was just a case of the big man falling through the cracks too often then, because after his initial year in WWE, it definitely felt like he was falling into that same trap so many other PG-era stars did. And this meant, even when he did win the WWE title again during the mid-2010s, the stop-start nature of his entire run made it feel like it wasn't that special. Sure, Sheamus still has a decent role on the show, and that's something which will likely continue to be the case all the way up until he retires, as at this point, he's pretty much an institution in WWE. But the idea of going all the way back to the main event scene again in 2025 or beyond, well, that feels like a stretch now. No, there's only so many times you can take a guy from the top of the card and hide him away in the mid-card for a few years before that just becomes the role he has long-term. And Sheamus isn't the only PG-era star of WWE who's fallen into this trap over the years either. No, up and down the WWE roster from that time period, we can see countless examples of such a situation playing itself out as the boss got bored with his new toy and threw it away so he could play with something else instead. It was certainly something which had an effect on our next subject, the man known to fans as The Miz. Now what you have in The Miz is WWE's ultimate utility player, someone who can be slotted into any role he's given and who will play that role to the best of his abilities without a single word of complaint. Yes, he's the kind of company guy Vince McMahon always dreamed of having. But this was also a double-edged sword for Mike Mizanin in many ways, because it meant that throughout his career, it would be all too easy to play the game of stop-start with his pushes. That's right, for every run The Miz had on top, he's had at least 2 of him stuck in the mid-card, doing little but either filling out TV time or getting someone else over. A strange move indeed when you consider the fact that this is a former WrestleMania main eventer we're talking about here. That said, even if his career has oscillated wildly between being a key part of the show and a mere background player, the Ohio native has more often than not managed to make it work. Yes, whether he's winning the WWE title from Randy Orton, then going on to successfully defend it against John Cena at the Showcase of the Immortals, or he's on the SmackDown mid-card putting over rookies like Carmelo Hayes, The Miz has always put 110% into everything he does. And whenever WWE has needed someone to play the PR game outside of the ring on red carpets and reality TV shows, he's been just as effective there. Really, he's at a point where he's pretty much Teflon now. If nothing else, it'll likely keep him in a job with the promotion for as long as he wants one. We honestly can't see any situation where he's cut from his contract at this point. No, we could very easily see him still being there as an ambassador well into his old age. Will he get his full legend status then? Or even in retirement, will The Miz still get the stop-start treatment when it comes to how importantly he's positioned within WWE's hierarchy? We guess we'll just have to wait and see what the answer to that question is, but let's move away from him for now and over to our next subject instead, someone who really felt like they were destined to be an undeniable main event star in WWE at one point, but who has seen his status fall over the years on account of his own stop-start push. That's right, it's time to talk about Finn Balor. Of course, you could trace the initial rise of Finn Balor all the way back to the late 2000s and early 2010s, as this was when, back when he was going by his original name of Prince Devitt, he was working as part of the New Japan roster. So when the Irishman was signed up to a WWE contract in 2014, big things were expected of him, especially as he already seemed to have an excellent handle on the pageantry aspect of his craft, something which was oh so important when getting over in WWE. And at least initially, it seemed like he was going to meet all the expectations which were set out against him, as during his run in NXT between 2014 and 2016, he'd become a two-time world champion. Sadly though, things would begin to falter at this point as, after being called up to the main roster during the latter year and quickly being rocketed up to the top of the card, an injury picked up during a botched buckle bomb led to him having to vacate the Universal title he'd won that very same night. And this would end up causing Vince McMahon to grow colder on the Prince, so cold that for the rest of his run in WWE, he'd be pushed only sporadically. Yes, while there was the occasional main event spot on the main roster, and while there was that excellent second run in NXT between 2019 and 2021 where he completely reinvented himself, much of the rest of Finn Balor's late 2010s and early 2020s in WWE would see him be relegated to the mid-card. Hell, even in his own stable, the Judgment Day, he's never really felt like the true main act. No, despite being a former world champion, he's always felt like he's been playing second fiddle to either Damian Priest, Dominic Mysterio, or even Rhea Ripley. As you would expect then, this has been undeniably demoralizing for the Irishman over time, but he has kept powering on through this, always with the hope that another big push will come for him. Will this happen before his career ends at this point? That's hard to say, as Triple H seems to have him very much slotted as a tag team guy in 2025. If things did turn around though and Finn suddenly caught fire, then we're sure he'd still be more than capable of performing like a main event singles guy. Who knows, with a bit of luck, he could even get a world title again. But he's not the only former NXT champion who's still searching for that big main roster push. No, when it comes to our next subject, we could say exactly the same thing, just as we could also say that they've been hampered by a number of stop-start pushes too. Who are we talking about here? Why, Karrion Cross, of course. Yes, if there's been anyone in recent WWE history who's really been hurt the most by stop-start pushes, then it might be Karrion Cross. After all, this is another guy who, like with Sheamus, checks all the obvious boxes for what a star should be. He certainly has the physique, the talking skills, and in-ring ability. So it should be no surprise to learn then that when he first joined the NXT roster back in 2020, he was treated like a big deal right out of the gate, with him almost immediately winning that brand's world title from Keith Lee. Unfortunately though, at this point, things would start to go wrong. And the reason they went wrong was because the New York native got injured soon thereafter, forcing him to vacate his belt before he could make a single defense. As you would expect then, this seriously hurt his momentum, though not enough to stop him from winning the NXT title for a second time before all was said and done. Even after he'd become a two-time NXT champion, however, things would not stabilize for Cross. No, the next few months would be characterized by him getting called up to the main roster, being given an all-time whopper of a bad rebrand, and then getting fired before fans could even return to arenas again. Where would he go from here? Well, to the surprise of many, back to WWE again. Yes, after Vince McMahon left the company for the first time and Triple H took over the booking, Karrion would be rehired, and this time set up for yet another big push. The only problem with this, however, was that push never fully materialized. All that happened instead was Cross mostly appearing in nothing matches during the middle of Raw, either that or milling around backstage with his wife and valet Scarlett. Yes, by the time the mid-2020s were in full effect, it felt like stop-start pushes had helped to kill any credibility the big man had left. That said, he has been given something of a lifeline in recent months, as after starting to gain momentum amongst fans, he's been the recipient of a push on TV again, one which has seen him locked in battle with Sami Zayn on both Raw and on PLEs. Will this finally take him all the way to the top of the card? That remains to be seen. But that's all been happening on Raw. What about SmackDown? Well, as it happens, they have their own act who's been the victim of a stop-start push in recent times, and this isn't just one person either. No, it's a whole stable of people in our next subjects, the Wyatt Six. That's right, this is a 5-for-1 entry, as in the Wyatt Six we have Joe Gacy playing the role of Huskus the Pig Boy, Dexter Lumis portraying Mercy the Buzzard, Eric Rowan giving us his rendition of Rambling Rabbit, Nikki Cross showing us what she can do with the Abby the Witch character, and of course, Bo Dallas paying tribute to his late brother Bray Wyatt by finishing up the story of his final creation, Uncle Howdy. Obviously then, being a more theatrical gimmick, there is a lot which could be mined out of the weird and wacky side of this one. So when the Wyatt Six first made a big splash on WWE TV during an episode of Raw in the summer of 2024 by laying waste to the entire backstage area, it was expected they'd be playing a big role on the show going forward, especially as the whole thing was being done in honor of the fallen Eater of Worlds. But alas, that's not really the way things have played out. No, despite being heavily featured for those first couple of weeks, the stable have since appeared rather sporadically, with them taking large gaps away from TV entirely before then returning and having to rebuild any momentum they had from scratch again. Fortunately though for the team, they have a loyal fan base who want to see Uncle Howdy and company succeed. And that's probably why their push status has occasionally moved back over to start again, as they'll get a run on SmackDown as tag team champions, the very spot they're in right now as it happens. Still though, the way things are going, we don't see this being a long-term spot for the Wyatt Six. No, the reality is that once they drop those belts, they'll probably end up disappearing from TV again for a while, all before then returning once more and maybe winning a mid-card title or two in order to heat themselves up again. But what about our next subject? A man who has run the gauntlet of importance on the card down on NXT and even on the main roster at points, a man known to fans as Apollo Crews. Now, if you were an indie wrestling fan back during the mid-2010s, then Apollo Crews is another name you would have no doubt been excited to see sign onto the dotted line with WWE, as back then, he was one of the top prospects out there. So it should come as no surprise that when he reported to NXT and started appearing at shows there in 2015, he had an initial wave of momentum. Sadly though, that momentum would end up sputtering out in record time, because by the point early 2016 had come around, the former Uhaa Nation would have been called up to Raw. Needless to say then, with this meaning he was now going to be booked by Vince McMahon, this was when his run truly faltered, as the rest of it would be characterized by the occasional push mixed in with vast waves of nothing. Yes, for every time Apollo was given a mid-card strap, put into a team with Titus O'Neil, or even given a Nigerian Prince gimmick, he'd be absent from the show entirely, or even worse, stuck in the dreaded 24/7 division. And all that has ultimately led us to the point we're now at, where few fans are behind the Sacramento native anymore, despite the fact he remains a very good in-ring performer. That's right, it's the Dolph Ziggler special. And what a crying shame this is, as had things gone just a little differently, and he'd been given more of a sustained push at any point, we might be looking at Apollo Crews in a completely different light today. Sure, he might never have been a world champion or anything, but he could have been a solid upper mid-card presence rather than the mostly absent warm body he is today. But that's not the way things worked out for him. But what about a talent that was given the stop-start push treatment down in NXT? Well, for that we need to look at our next subject, Eddie Thorpe. That's right, Eddie Thorpe might not be the most familiar name out there for fans today, as in truth, he didn't actually do anything on either Raw or SmackDown. That said, he did have a good run on NXT between 2023 and 2025, albeit one which was marred by an extreme inconsistency. Yes, after having a run in New Japan during his early years, it would be towards the middle of the 2020s that the man formerly known as Carl Fredericks made the jump down to Florida to join the developmental brand. And given the fact he'd already proved he could hang in New Japan Pro Wrestling, the expectation was that Thorpe would hopefully be able to succeed in NXT too. And at points, it felt like he was doing just this, particularly during his feuds with the likes of Dijak and Trick Williams. But unfortunately, while that latter feud especially saw him reach the level of world title contender, too much of Eddie's time in NXT saw him be wasted as his push was halted all of a sudden. And that would lead to a situation where, in May of 2025, Thorpe's 2-year tenure with the company came to an abrupt end when he was cut from his contract. What has he done since then? Well, nothing as of yet, though we do anticipate him making a return to Japan before too much time has passed. So it's not like Carl Fredericks doesn't have options for the future. But let's move away from the men for now and over to the women instead, as we have plenty of examples of stop-start pushes in that division too. One of the most notable of which has happened with our next subject, Asuka. Now, there was a point in time where many fans have considered Asuka to be perhaps the best women's wrestler in the world. After all, during her early years in Japan, she was an absolute force of nature as Kana, the murder clown. So when she joined WWE in 2015 then, we all hoped this would be something which would translate over to America. And to be fair to WWE here, it did translate at first, because during her time in the developmental brand, the Osaka native would go entirely undefeated, all while having a record reign as women's champion. However, when she was called up to the main roster in 2017, things would go differently for Asuka. Sure, she would start out strong on Raw too, even going as far as to win the first ever Women's Royal Rumble match in 2018. But once she earned her first loss against Charlotte Flair at WrestleMania 34, her aura as an unbeatable monster would immediately start to wane, and this would lead to her booking growing increasingly more erratic, as now, rather than being treated like the stone cold killer she had been both back in Japan and down in NXT, Asuka became more of a utility player, someone who could win a match, sure, but who could also lose just as many. Even when she was getting a push, such as happened when she was paired up with Kairi Sane as one half of the Kabuki Warriors, those pushes would always end up being short-lived. Yes, in the 2020s, the former NXT Women's Champion has now become a female version of that man we mentioned earlier, Dolph Ziggler, and that she can still be counted on to have a good match and get over with fans, but she's unlikely going to be the face of a division again. Could things have been different if she was booked more consistently on the main roster? Yes. There's absolutely no reason Asuka couldn't be on the same level as Io Sky today, but that's not how things have gone. Still though, at least the Osaka native can rest easy knowing she's not the only woman in WWE who suffered from stop-start booking in recent years. No, we can find another example of this right now in our next subject, Zoe Stark. Unlike Asuka, Zoe Stark was not someone who made a big name for herself prior to joining WWE in 2021. No, at that point, she was still pretty much a fresh rookie. But despite this, in a very short space of time, she was able to prove she had something by rising up the ranks of the NXT roster to the point that, come 2022, she'd arguably be one of the top names in that division. Needless to say then, when she was called up to Raw soon thereafter, it felt like that true big push was just around the corner for the Salt Lake City native. But much to her chagrin, that's not what happened. No, while she would get some early focus by aligning herself with Trish Stratus, this never led to a big blow-off bout between the pair once they inevitably split a few months later. No, rather than the alliance being used to boost Zoe up the card, it felt like she got pushed to the side and forgotten. And this would only be the first example of stop-start booking affecting her on the main roster. Yes, ever since this point, every time it's looked like WWE were going to do something with Stark, her momentum has immediately stalled. Will things change for her as years progress? It's hard to say, but we certainly hope it does. But what about our next subject? A former rising star of WWE who suffered greatly from stop-start booking, Cameron Grimes. That's right, there was a period on NXT back during the early 2020s where it felt like he was truly breaking out as a superstar. And the way he was doing this was by morphing into a man who had bought stock in GameStop early, and as a result, had become mega rich, a modern-day million-dollar man, if you will. Hell, at one point, Grimes would even win the $1 million title, something he earned after beating LA Knight for the honor. And at another point, he'd win an even bigger title when he became North American champion for a while too. Sadly though, that would end up being his peak in WWE, as upon being called up to the main roster in 2023, the stop part of his stop-start push began. What happened here exactly? Well, it appears that the main roster booking team had no plan for what to do with Grimes once he was called up, and that led to him spending months doing little of note, all while his momentum just frittered away into nothingness. So bad would things get after a while, even during his brief return to NXT, Cameron would lose. And not long after that, he'd be cut from his contract. What a waste this was then, as if he'd just been given a push on SmackDown the way he had on NXT, there's no telling what kind of heights the North Carolinian could have reached. Could he have gone all the way to the world title? Maybe not, but then who knows? We all saw how high one of his former rivals in NXT, LA Knight, rose after the fact, so there's no reason Grimes couldn't have had a similar trajectory. But for one reason or another, despite coming onto the main roster with a huge amount of momentum, WWE decided to put a stop to this once he was called up. Really, we do hope he gets another chance at some point, as there is a lot of talent to be mined from the man once more going by the name of Trevor Lee. Of course, even if that second chance never comes, Cameron Grimes will always be able to say that he had the talent to make it, and that if things had worked out a little differently, he could have indeed gone all the way to the moon. But then the same could be said about everyone we've looked at today.